Hi there. In this video, I will continue my presentation for the database controls. If you remember, in the previous video, we talked about the different types of controls, which we classified them into preventive, detective, and corrective. From the other hand, we classified the environment of controls into general and application. General related to the whole environment, application related to the transactions itself. And then we talked about 4 different levers of control. The first one, belief and boundary. And we said those 2 systems addressing the preventive control, the diagnostic address the detective control, the interactive address the corrective control. So they are matching together. Then I end my presentation last time in the previous video talking about the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act and Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And in brief, I said the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act put restrictions on the governmental employee from taking any kind of benefit for the sake of giving unfair advantage to the organization or person. Then we said Sarbanes-Oxley Act, it's the act that has been issued in 2002 regarding the CEO and the CFO that they should be responsible about the reliability of the financial statements, the compliance with law, and the effectiveness and efficiency of the operation. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the different types of frameworks that the company can use to control the database. When I talk about a framework, it's guidelines, it's policy. So I am not going to talk about the technical work that we should do to make internal control, but this is the guideline that the board of directors can use, approve. The executive management will put it in practice and then start going down to all the employees. So here I am talking about the executive levels, and the different types of frame control mainly are COBIT, which is related to the corporate governance and the asset management, KOSO, the Committee of Sponsoring Organization Internal Control, and ERN. So let us go to the COBIT and see what is the framework of COBIT. It's the framework that makes it clear distinction between governance and management. What do we mean by governance? We say those who govern the company, which are usually the board of directors, are not and should not be the same as the management, because the management includes only the executive management. So first we need to separate between the governance body and the management. And we said the board of directors, which is the governance body, is responsible for evaluation, direction, monitoring the executive management. The executive management should be responsible for aligning, planning, organizing the workflow, and then build, acquire, and implement the assets, run the transaction, deliver service and support, and then monitor, evaluate, and assess. So those are the steps that should be made by the management to ensure that the flow of the information, the database is working accurately. They have enough assets and human power to do the transactions, and they have enough controls to monitor the information. The governance body comes above them to check it out. And here is an explanation. Feel free to stop the video, read the screen, and move to the next slide. Here is also a figure that can help you to understand the COBIT principles. First of all, we say the COBIT principles aim to achieve the stakeholders' need, cover the enterprise end-to-end, I mean starting from employees and going up to the board of directors, then apply a single integrated framework, enable a holistic approach and not focused on one department or one company, and then separating the governance body, which is the board of directors, from the executive management. And based on that, we start to put the implementation for each one of them. So how we meet the shareholders' need? Here we go. We start by the enabler goals, then we go to the IT related goals, enterprise goals, and then we go to the stakeholders. Then how we make the holistic approach, then starting by the principles, policy, and framework that should spread around for all the enterprise enablers. And then starting for this one, the separation of governance from management, we put here the framework that align, plan, and organize, build, acquire, and implement, deliver the services, and then we do monitoring. So here I am trying to explain how the establishment of the COVID components are set up by the governing body and the executive management, and what we should do from the management side to maintain the COVID framework going through. And here is a clear representation for all the responsibilities of the management and the board of directors. Again, feel free to stop the video, go through the slides, and then continue. And of course, if you check IASCA, which is the main body that issued COVID framework, they have lots of documents about COVID framework. Now let us go to KOSO Framework, which is issued by another body, the Committee of a Sponsoring Organization. And they define the internal control as a process that never ends. It's affected by the board of directors, the management, and any important personnel like big stakeholders, that they ensure that the process is working to provide reasonable assurance regarding three elements: financial statements, operation, and compliance with law. Make sure the financial statements are reliable, the operations are running effectively and efficiently, and the company is in compliance with all the different laws and regulations. And KOSO framework has 5 key elements that we will discuss it in this video. The first one is setting up the control environment to ensure that we are able to make internal control. Without having an environment, we cannot make a good internal control. So what we need to do, starting from the board of directors, going down to the executive management, going down to the HR, to the all employees, this is the control environment. Then try to assess the risk by checking all the changes, because whenever we change anything in the system, there is a possibility of having risk. And how can we make the different activities to control the risk? How we enter the information and communicate and disseminate the reports among the different stakeholders, and then make some kind of monitoring. So let us go to the control environment, the first element in this framework. We say the control environment starts by putting the right mindset for the board of directors, the executive management, and departments, employees, and then HR. So as you can see, the HR, it's the main gate for having all the employees embracing the internal control mindset and try to apply. And we said here, we have to have integrity and ethical value throughout all this hierarchy. So we have to ensure that we have policies, we have code of conduct, and so on. And then we have different bodies from outside that they come to check that the internal control is in practice, like SEC, FAS, PCAOB, Stock Exchange, and different agencies. So what shall we do to ensure that the control environment is in practice? As I said, we should have integrity and ethical value. Check the participation of the board of directors and audit committee, management philosophy and operating style, organizational structure, authority and responsibility, HR, and external influences. So now we need to know what has been mentioned in KOSO framework under each one of those elements. First of all, we say all the employees, they should maintain the integrity and ethical value by having code of conduct, minimum requirement for competence, avoid unrealistic expectation, and actively teach and require good practice of internal control, consistently rewarding honestly and penalizing the dishonest. If we maintain these principles, this will set up the environment for good internal control. Then ensure that the board of directors and the audit committee, they have some degree of independence from the executive management. They have experience. They are able to delegate the actions to the executive management, and they have extent into their involvement of business, so they don't run the day-to-day activities. And those should be the main characteristics for the board of directors and the audit committee. Now, for the audit committee, they are responsible for hiring and firing the external auditor. They have oversight over the internal audit team, and the audit committee is responsible for making any resolution between the external auditor and the management if there is any disagreement happens, and of course approve any non-audit service for the audit. From the management side, the management should embrace a good risk appetite, which can measure their tolerance of risk. The management approach to taking and monitoring business risk is very essential. And how is the management attitude and action towards financial reporting? And finally, the management attitude towards the information processing. So to set up the environment, as I said, we start by the board of directors, then we go down to the audit committee, then we go down to the management, and then we go to each employee through the organizational structures, whether department heads or employee. Check the system, either it's centralized or decentralized, direct reporting or matrix reporting, and so on. Then we check the authority and the responsibility of each employee through their job description. So we ensure that the job description and the organizational chart is able to show each employee his responsibility and his authority. And then we ensure that the human resource department is qualified to set up the standard for hiring, compensation, training, firing, discharging, and all the vacation and relationship. So we check that the human resource is able to hire the right person, train the right person, reward the person, and if there is any kind of illegal action, the HR is able to discipline the person and maybe dismiss him. Finally, the external influence like the stock exchange, FASB, PCAOB, they might have an input into the internal control system of the company. So this is the first point in KOSO framework, is show us how the environment should be set up for embracing the internal control system. Then the second point is the risk assessment. The risk assessment, we have two different types of risks we need to define here. First, we call it inherent risk. The second one, residual risk. The inherent risk, it's the susceptibility of a set of account for any kind of mistakes in the absence of internal control. So if there is no internal control, there might be some risk to that account. But the residual risk, we say, even if we have an internal control, there might be a risk of something to happen. So the difference between inherent risk and residual risk is the existence of the internal control. The first one talks about the absence of internal control and what might happen to the data or the account. The residual risk talks about the existence of the internal control, but the inability of the internal control to discover the risk. And we try to classify the different types of risk through this risk mapping. And as you can see here, we try to measure the impact of the risk and the percentage or likelihood of the risk. And we say if the risk has high impact, and high likelihood, it's high risk. Or the yellow zone, which is the medium risk, green zone, which is the low risk. And based on our assessment of the risk, we set up the control activities. What are the strategies we should embrace for the risk? We can either avoid the risk. As I said here, we don't proceed with the transactions, or mitigate the risk by putting some kind of controls. And this is the whole point behind this chapter, is try to mitigate the risk for the database by implying the COVID control, KOSO framework, and so on, to reduce the risk, or transfer the risk by making insurance on the data set, or accepting the risk if the risk is very small, or creation of the risk, seek risk and activities. And this is what we usually do it when we go for a stock investment. We try to create a risk here on a hope that we can get reward for that. Now let us move to the control activities, which we mainly put it to control the previous step in the framework, which is the assessment of risk. The control activities, and here we have preventive, detective, corrective control, or compensating and manual control. And this is what we explained it in the previous video. And then good example of that, we do approvals, authorization, and this, if you remember, the preventive control, and then we make reconciliation like detective control, and then segregation of duties and so on. Now, the preventive control, it's prevent the risk from happening before it happens. The detective try to discover the risk after it happened, and corrective is taking the simple actions. And here I put some examples, but because for the sake of the video time, I'm not going to go through them, but you can feel free to stop the video and go through them by yourself. As I said, we might have compensating control and corrective control, automated or manual control. Here we make segregation of duties, as I mentioned. The segregation of duties in the database, it talks about people in charge of the IT department and how we segregate the jobs to ensure there is some kind of controls on their handling of data. So the users, they have access to the records only. The operators, they have access to the software. The programmer receive the information from the system design to create program. The system analyst receive the information from the users to design the system and then pass it on to the programmer. The change manager is able to do only changes in the system. The network manager is responsible for the devices. The security manager and the system administrator responsible for the whole system. So remember here, when I talk about segregation, I talk about those who are in charge of the database to ensure that not one person is doing two jobs, because he might make a mistake or intentional error and cover it up. And then we have here different types of people that they are in charge of the project development and acquisition control, starting by steer committee, which is overseeing the development and acquisition, going down to the strategic master plan for setting up the plan, project development plan to perform the tasks, data process schedule to set the time frame for each task, system performance measure to evaluate the system measurement, and finally make review for the project. So to wrap up what we said so far, that we need to create the suitable environment, assess the risk that might happen to the data through the different types of changes, and classify the risk into inherent and residual, put the different control activities, whether preventive, detective, corrective. And now let us move on to the information and communication. The information is necessary to carry out the internal control. And then communication, it's the continual iterative process of providing, sharing, and obtaining the information. Make sure that all the information in the journal entries essentially is correct and communicated through the accounting cycle in the right way. to communicate the right information to the right people at the right time. This is the key point. What are the things we need to communicate? We need to communicate the standard, the expectations, the policy, the procedures, the initiatives, the goal, the changes, the opportunities, and able to answer any information or questions. Monitoring, and this is what we usually do it by the internal audit department that comes on a quarterly basis to check that all the functions are working correct and on time. So we make ongoing evaluation, which is built into the system process that can check every transaction to ensure that the information is correct. And we make separate evaluation, which is mainly done by the internal audit department. Okay. The last one, it's KOSO ERM, the Enterprise Risk Management, which is slightly bigger than KOSO Internal Control. In KOSO Internal Control, we talked about 5 elements, but here we set up the 4 elements, but when we come to the risk, we expand it into objective settings, event identification, risk assessment, and risk response. And this is related, as I said, to risk assessment. And here we put each one of them. We say the objective setting, we put a strategic objective, which is at the high level, operational objectives, effectiveness and efficiency of operation. Reporting objective, we make sure that the reporting is reliable and compliance with laws and regulations. Then event identification, we ask some questions. What could go wrong? How can it go wrong? What is the potential harm and what can be done about it? And this is what we usually ask before we make any audit, to try to identify the event that might have risk. Then based on our identification, we assess the amount of risk. So here we try to identify the threat, it's any potential adverse occurrence, and the impact in dollar value. And the percentage or the likelihood that might happen, is it 10%, 5%, 60%, and so on? Then we multiply the impact by the likelihood to get the amount of loss. And of course, if the loss is above our benchmark, then it's material. If it's below, immaterial. And based on our estimated of loss, excuse me, we might reduce the risk by implementing effective control, accept the risk if the loss amount is very small, share the risk by having insurance, or avoid the risk but not engaging in the activities. So in this video, I was trying to show you quickly the different frameworks, whether COVID or KOSO Internal Control or KOSO ERM, and I hope you find this video useful. Thank you. Bye-bye.